The Graduate Center of the City University of New York is a perfect location for tonight's conversation about migration. We've got extraordinary students here in a range of disciplines, studying with renowned faculty across the school on issues related to immigration, migration, and their impacts on the people doing the migration and the places where they end up. Throughout our history, of course, the City University of New York has provided access to higher education to generations of new immigrants and their children. And today, I have to say, I'm very proud of this number. The Graduate Center educates students here in our doctoral and master's programs in the arts and sciences from nearly 80 countries. The Graduate Center is also renowned for our scholarship and research on immigration itself, and I want to highlight here, especially for those of you who want to pursue this study or who know people who do, a new interdisciplinary master's program in international migration studies. Tonight's panel, Migrations, Rewriting America, brings together two authors celebrated for their writing about immigration and two leading scholars of migration who make their professional homes at CUNY and here at the GC. So I'm very honored and proud to introduce them to you now. Suketu Mehta was born in India and raised in Bombay and New York. He's an associate professor of journalism at New York University, where I spent a few years some time ago, and his work has appeared in publications from The New Yorker to National Geographic. He's also appeared on NPR's Fresh Air and All Things Considered, I'm sure shows familiar to all of us. His forthcoming book is titled This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto, and it draws both on his experience as an Indian-born teenager growing up in New York City and his years of reporting from around the world. Salman Rushdie called this book, and I quote, a brilliant and urgently necessary book, eloquently making the case against bigotry and for all of us migrants. Gary Shteyngart immigrated to the United States from Leningrad when he was 7, and I just learned a few minutes ago when his name was Igor. He's connected to CUNY. He has a degree from Hunter, and he has been called, and I quote, a master of dislocation for books that brilliantly and imaginatively capture with both one-liners and deep insight what it means to be an immigrant in America. He's the author of the memoir Little Failure and novels like these, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, Absurdistan, and my favorite title and my favorite novel of his work, Super Sad True Love Story. His latest book is Lake Success. The New York Times reviewer wrote that in this book, Shteyngart holds his adopted country up to the light, turns it, squints, turns it some more, and finds himself grimacing and laughing in almost equal measure. Nancy Foner is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center. She's the author or editor of 18 books, more than 100 articles and book chapters, focusing on such issues as New York City immigration in past and present, race and ethnicity, gender, and family dynamics. Her latest book was written by Richard Alba, another colleague of hers here at the GC. Its title is Strangers No More, Immigration and the Challenges of Integration in North America and Western Europe. Philip Kasinitz, here on my left, is Presidential Professor of Sociology at the Graduate Center and acting director of that program I mentioned, our new master's program in international migration. He specializes in the study of urban sociology, international migration, race, and ethnicity. His books include Caribbean New York, Black Immigrants and the Politics of Race, Inheriting the City, The Children of Immigrants Come of Age, and most recently, The Urban Ethnography Reader. In addition to his academic writing, Phil's work has been published in The Nation, Dissent, The Wall Street Journal, and other publications. He currently serves on the Historical Advisory Board of the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation, particularly appropriate given his interest in immigration. So please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel and have a wonderful evening.
Does this automatically go on? Yes, okay. So thanks very much. I'm going to start out just with a few words before we move on to our distinguished guests. But I want to just say first thanks to Joy for the very gracious introductions, and also again to thank the organizers of the Carnegie Hall Migration Festival for having us on their program. And actually afterwards you can get, I think, flyers outside that can tell you more about other events. So it's a great thrill to be on a panel with such an eminent group, with Suketu Mehta and Gary Shteyngart, two writers whose work I've admired for such a long time, and also with my Graduate Center colleague, Phil Kasinitz. So before we zero in on immigrants and American culture, which is the focus of tonight's discussion, I just want to provide a little bit of background about today's immigration, which has been transforming virtually every aspect of American society. And this has a lot to do with the sheer numbers and their remarkable diversity which they've brought to America. So after about more than half a century now of massive, large-scale immigration, the US is now home to 45 million immigrants, which now represent 14% of the population. And if we add on their US-born children, we're talking about a quarter of the US population. This is the biggest absolute number, the 45 million, in American history, and even this 14% is inching up to the high of 15% in 1910. We're living, of course, in the quintessential immigrant city in America. 1 out of 3 New Yorkers is now an immigrant, and again, we need to add on the US-born children of immigrants in New York, and it's well over half of the city. New York also stands out for its incredible diversity, with sizable numbers of immigrants from all over the world, not just Asia and Latin America, which are the groups that dominate outside of New York, but also from Eastern Europe, from the Caribbean, and increasingly in New York from Africa as well. And speaking of New York, we're going to start with the way it's going to work is Phil and I are going to pose some questions for our distinguished guests. We'll start out with talking about New York, and even more specific, about Queens. And you might say, why Queens, right? Queens actually happens to be the place where 3 of us, myself, Suketu, and Gary, I spent all my childhood there. They spent part of their childhood there. And Queens features certainly very strongly in Gary's new book, Lake Success, and it also features in Suketu's new book, This Land is Our Land. My childhood Queens neighborhood, don't worry, I'm not going to talk much about it. I'm just going to say a few words. I grew up in sort of the borderlands of Fresh Meadows and Bayside. It was much less diverse when I was growing up than it is today. Now, that's partly because I'm older than Gary and Suketu. In my childhood, it was all white. It was the children and grandchildren of earlier Irish, Jewish, and Italian immigrants, very different from Queens today, which is one of the most ethnically and racially diverse places in the whole United States, and where half of the population, 1 million people, is foreign-born. So with those, let me ask the question to start us off. So my question to Gary and Suketu is, how did growing up in Queens, this amazing crucible of immigrants today, affect your writing? So I don't know who wants to start off.
All right, Queen's Pride, screw Amazon. Thank you so much, Nancy and Phil and everyone at the Grad Center for inviting us. Hacks to penetrate. I've often used Nancy and Phil's work in my own work about immigration. I'm writing a book about New York as well, and they're the preeminent scholars of immigration, I think, in the country, so I'm very honored to be here. Yeah, Queens was, I came to Queens from Bombay in 1977, and I was 14 at the time, and it was a very different Queens. I came to Jackson Heights, and my parents put me in the nearest, what in India might be called a convent school, which basically means a Catholic school, and I was one of the first minorities in the school, and it was not a pleasant experience. It was an all-boys Catholic school, and I was meat thrown to the lions. So 3 pretty unhappy years in that non-diverse school in an increasingly diversifying neighborhood. And I'm pleased to say that that same Catholic school now has been overrun by South Asians. So we overwhelmed them through sheer numbers, as we plan to do to the nation. Queens it made me a writer, because in Bombay, I might meet Bengalis or South Indians, and in Jackson Heights, I started meeting people from all over the world. So I grew up in a building on 83rd Street filled with Indians and Pakistanis, Dominicans, Haitians, Russians, Chinese. The building was owned by a Greek man. The building was owned by a Turkish man, but the super was Greek. So all these people were killing each other just before they got on the plane. But here we were living next door to each other and, sharing our strange foods because, Indians and Pakistanis might hate each other in India and Pakistan, but here we both like samosas. So it was really interesting growing up in that building, and it was full of stories. The only time that the building, came together, Sunday mornings, we came together in rousing song because there was a program called Vision of Asia on Channel 47, WNJU Newark, which had Bollywood movies and songs. And all the Russians, Uzbeks, Indians, Pakistanis sang along to the Bollywood songs. It was a fascinating place to grow up. I spent 8 years in Jackson Heights, and for my new book, I go back to Jackson Heights all the time, just to collect stories.
Queens also made me a writer. That should be a T-shirt, right? By the way, great to be back at CUNY. My favorite degree came from CUNY, so go CUNY. So I came in '79 from Leningrad, and we settled in Kew Gardens. And the first thing that happened was my father was very much into being Jewish, which was, of course, not possible back in the Soviet Union. So I was sentenced to 8 years of Hebrew school for a crime I did not commit. It was unbelievable. My nickname was the Red Gerbil. These kids did not like Russians, and I kept saying, but I'm a Jew like you. And in fact, it got so bad that I pretended that I wasn't even born in Leningrad. I was born in East Berlin. Things are bad when you're trying to convince Jewish kids you're actually a German, But when I say it made me a writer, what I mean is that this is where I began to protest on the page. And I began to write these satires, because all these rabbis hated me. So I wrote, instead of the Torah, it was called the Gemara, And instead of Exodus, there was Sexodus. And instead of Sarah, there was Brooke Shieldowitz, which we were in love with. So, it was my first... nobody wanted to be friends with me until I started writing these satires, because one thing everybody hated was these oppressive rabbis and stuff. So for me, this was a kind of way to assimilate, was to write. But Queens, I love Queens. I mean, I think it's, to me, it is the most, and I think Suketu might agree, it is the most fascinating of New York's boroughs. It's a very strange place. It doesn't feel, for so long, we were too scared to go to Manhattan. We heard bad things happen there. I thought that those three giant buildings in Queens, the Parker Towers, I thought that was Manhattan. Those towers off Queens Boulevard. Because it was, it was that provincial, but at the same time, there's that feeling, it's almost like as close to quote-unquote real America as you can get, because there's low-lying buildings, there's single and two-family homes. All this stuff makes it feel like you're sort of in the America that you've seen on TV before, but you're also not, because you're part of this giant metropolitan area. So I teach a master's of writing at Columbia, and I always tell my kids, don't just go to Berlin the way all of you are going to go. Some of you go to Queens, because that's more interesting and almost as cheap.
Being from Brooklyn, I'm feeling a little outnumbered all of a sudden. I actually, though, one of the worst things that a social scientist can do is tell any artist that they're a representative of a category or a group. But you guys are both what people in my business call 1.5 generation immigrants. That's the people who were born abroad, but most of your coming of age occurred on this side of the water. And the combination of 1.5 and second generation immigrants is now the plurality group in New York among younger people. Among people under 40, they outnumber both people who came as adults and the children of natives. So, and being a child of immigrants is kind of interesting because you've got to figure out a lot of stuff on your own. Your parents are not the best guides to this new society. So I'm wondering if you've thought, I know you both have written a good deal about this, what your feeling about being 1.5 generation has done to your writing.
That's neither here nor there.
Yeah, exactly.
There was actually an exhibition at the Queen's Museum called Generation 1.5, and I was interviewed along with the Indian writer Kiran Desai, who also came here at age 13, and that was in the preface to the catalog. So, it raised some very interesting questions, because as this sort of halfling, you've grown up in one place, but you're never quite well in your skin in the place that you've immigrated to. So in my case, I often just went back and forth between Bombay and New York until I ended up moving back to Bombay to see if I could live there. And I lived there for 2.5 years, wrote a book about it. And only then could I come back. And, so these questions of where I belonged preoccupied me until the birth of my first son in Manhattan. So, and that really fixed me in a very lovely way. I have 2 sons, and for me, home now will be pretty much wherever they happen to be living. So I meet lots of artists and writers who've also grown up in someplace else and have come here, and it gives us an interesting insider-outsider perspective on the places we've immigrated to and also the places we've come from. And I think it really makes us non-nativists, because we can see that you don't really have to pledge full allegiance to any one place. You can actually go back and forth, and that you realize that, your home is a palace, it's the earth. You could take any one of us and plunk us in Rome now for a bit, and, we could find home there too.
Yeah, I agree. I was just doing an article where I had to hang out with an anti-Camorra cop in Naples. Camorra is the local mafia, and my Italian's not great, his English was non-existent, but there was some kind of cool immigrant feeling that we immediately started talking about cannolis, and it just went from there. I do feel this great, and I worked for a long time as a travel writer, and being an immigrant, I think, is very helpful to that kind of feeling. Yeah, 1.5 is a great place to be as an artist, as a writer, I think, because of everything you've said, that kind of feeling of being both in and out of a certain milieu. You're also the translator in a big way. I don't know if it's the same, because I imagine your parents spoke some English, right, when they came?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I remember one of my jobs very early on was my grandmother lived in an almost all Russian building, a Section 8 building in Rego Park, Queens. And all these old Russian babushkas spent their days denouncing one another to the Social Security Administration. So, Galina in 5G, she is a Finnish spy. That was a big category. Everybody was a Finnish spy. I don't know why. So, they would say Finnish spy in Russian, Finlandska špionka, and I'd write Finnish spy in my third grade English. So you take on that role, but that role is great toward becoming a storyteller later on, because you're constantly telling stories back and forth between 2 communities. So I teach a class on immigrant fiction at Columbia, and it's fascinating. Almost every person we tackle is the very definition of a 1.5 immigrant. Chang Rae Lee, the wonderful Korean-American writer, Junot Diaz, etc. So, and they almost all came within a certain band of, I think it's my feeling of, it wasn't having a kid, although I did that as well. It was learning to drive. And I spent half my year upstate New York, and learning to drive to a mall, and then parking in the mall without hitting anyone, and then buying family-sized products. To me, that feels like America. Saving a buck, and then carrying this thing to your car. is how I define, that's when I felt like, okay, I belong here now.
Sorry, I have to hold on to this. So I'm just curious as to, in your newest book, like Success, your lead character is not an immigrant or a 1.5, or, I mean, what's, could you struck Barry, his name is.
So this is the other thing. So once you've succeeded to some extent writing about being an immigrant, that's all people want to hear. And so many writers I know have had wonderful books which didn't feature immigrant protagonists, and the reviewers were like, well, this is nice, but why the hell aren't you being Korean? That's what you were born to do. And so I decided also all of us want to do this at one point. Every immigrant writer I know wants to write a novel where the main character is not an immigrant. So the book I did, Lake Success, my last book, the very main protagonist, Barry Cohen, is an American-born Jew. So still a Jew, baby steps, but his wife, Seema, is a daughter of Indian immigrants. So there's at least some talk of immigrants in the book. I can't quite shy away from it entirely, but you do want to write, and it is a question, I guess, that you ask yourself, like, how much can I get away with writing about things that are not what people buy my books for the most part, And I don't know. It's a real kind of act of emancipation to say that I belong here enough that I can, because I also think that immigrant writers not just write about immigrant communities with great style. I'm not saying me, I'm saying others, but also understand America in a way that sometimes native-born people don't. So.
One more question for you. So Mike, sorry, okay. So how come he lives in grew up in Little Neck?
So I grew up in Little Neck partly too.
Little Neck, Queens.
Little Neck, Queens. So I grew up partly in Little Neck, which was an Irish-Italian kind of neighborhood, working class, and now is an Indian/Korean/ you name it kind of neighborhood. So it was the whitest part of quasi-suburbia Queens. But also Little Neck for me, we were right across. We were one house away from Great Neck, and Great Neck was the dream, right? Because if you could make it to Great Neck, that was it, but we were always Little Neckers, which was the term for us. We never graduated to Great Neck, and I never forgot that, and that's why the name of this book is Lake Success.
But it's also, I think, very interesting in Lake Success, the extent to which your main character, who's very, very successful, but he lives in a world that's incredibly diverse and is filled with 1.5 and second-generation immigrants. In the meantime, he grew up in a different kind of world that was also diverse in its own way.
Well, the big diversity that happened to me, so look, when we went to Hebrew school, there was Israeli, Soviet Jew, that's not that much diversity, but but for me the big thing was getting into Stuyvesant High School, which is a certain math and science holding pen for multinational nerds in Manhattan. And that's where most of my friends became Asians, and to this day, Suketu is one of my very good friends. I would say most of my friends are Korean or Indian, or in fact, there was a paper written about friendships formed between Koreans, Soviet Jews, Gujarati Indians, which is you, and some Nigerians, some of the Nigerian groups, because of our, I don't know, intense mercantilism. What's the?
Because we all went to Stuyvesant together.
We all went to Stuyvesant, exactly. So that to me was the breakout, the feeling that I had about seeing a multi-ethnic society for the first time, and so almost all my books featured this kind of cast of characters who are all children of immigrants themselves, but all come from all over and are all desperate to succeed because otherwise our parents would punch us. Very simple, that was their form of child rearing. In Russia there's a phrase: "He who does not hit does not love," and I think that says it all.
Let me just ask Suketu a question, because then we can go back to that. But this is actually, your breakout book, maybe, Maximum City, is about Bombay, right? So, here you were in New York, having your troubles, right, and growing up in Jackson Heights, and then you're moving to New Jersey, correct? And then you wrote your big, now you're back to New York, but previously, I don't know, do you want to talk a bit about, how you got into writing a Maximum City?
Well, it's just I wanted to know if I could go home again. And with the birth of my second son, I wanted to take them to a country where they, if I took them to school when they came out, they wouldn't stand out like I did. And so I tried it out, and I realized you can go home again. And the kind of book that I wrote about Bombay was very different than the kind of book that I was contemplating. But I couldn't have written that book if I hadn't left Bombay. So I went back and I lived there, and I realized that New York was home too, and I really missed New York. And besides, my parents were living in New Jersey, and what children need most is grandparents when they're growing up. So we moved back. And then I've been going back and forth, but increasingly I realized that I wanted to write a book about New York. And these are the only two big city books that I want to write. And they're very, very similar, Bombay and New York, where Bombay takes in people from all over India, and New York takes in people from all over the world. And I think that's what urban writers feed off, this diversity of storytelling.
Well, actually, since you both just mentioned parents, I was going to say that one of the kind of defining features of the 1.5 generation kids is this strange inversion of the relationship with parents, right? Because you understand the society better than they do most of the time. And of course, the child who says to the parent, "Dad, you do nothing about the way the world," I mean, every teenager in the world has said that. I mean, that was originally written in hieroglyphics, probably. But for the children of immigrants, it's really true, right? The people who are supposed to be your guides to the new society are uniquely incapable of doing that, and yet they're still in authority. And I thought a lot of that is running through Little Failure and many of your other books. I was wondering if you see that as an issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because one of the look, we both come from societies where you honor your parents. Boy, do you honor your parents. And for a while, I just wanted to be exactly who they were, and they were, politically speaking, very right-wing people. My father gave money to Rabbi Kahana. Yes. This is when we didn't have a lot of money to give away, and he still found $500 to hand to the Kahana Chai campaign. So, and I wanted to be like that. I mean, my father was a big, brawny man, very athletic compared to me. I looked up to him. He was the symbol of masculinity, and he and my mother had these. Look, I mean, the Soviet Union, despite its socialist leanings, was a very racist society, and I think that was true of many of our co-religionists and many of the Soviet Jews who had moved here. We were incredibly scared of anyone who was African American or Latino, even though the joke was that in our neighborhoods there almost were no African Americans or Latinos. These were as white neighborhoods as you can find in Queens at that point. They were very Archie Bunkerish. But that's, so growing up like that and feeding off that racism was a big part of my life. And I think after I started going to Stuyvesant, making friends who obviously weren't white, that was a huge revelation for me. Seeing that, in fact, they were much smarter than my co-religionists back in Hebrew school, where the myth of Jews as the people of the book died every day. So that journey away from that and toward a school, let's call it Oberlin, right? That journey away from my parents was the big journey of my life, I think. And it's a tough one because you want, and it's one that's very germane, I think, to people today who are, if you look at your Twitter feed, everyone's saying, how do I love my family? They're all pro-Trump and stuff like that. But learning to understand where they came from, not to excuse their politics, but to sort of create a kind of détente so that you can still have a relationship with them, I think is a big part of being an immigrant, being a 1.5 kid, because I think it's true for a lot of us that we have parents with whom, either politically or in another way, we have simply grown apart, and that's just a part of what happens when your parents bring you somewhere and they change less. And often I find that immigrants who came here changed less than the people who have stayed behind in their home countries, who seem to advance more in terms of politics, progressiveness, et cetera, than the people who came here, who are, for example, most Soviet immigrants I know are still living in 1979, the year they emigrated, and will always continue to do so.
I noticed that in your book, that collection of articles that you edited, Nancy, 1 out of 3, which is this wonderful collection of essays of immigrant groups all over the world. Phil has an essay in there. And what I noticed in many of those articles was these kind of bewilderment that immigrants' parents feel that in this country you're not allowed to hit your children. And I noticed this in the people that I meet as I go around collecting stories for my New York book. You can't hit your kids here. The comic Russell Peters has a wonderful routine about, the tone that his Anglo-Indian father would take in Canada. Somebody gonna get hurt real bad. And it certainly happened in my own family, and I come from a long line of angry Indian fathers. And it was just, when I asked my father later on why he would do this, I said, well, it's just how my father raised me and his father raised him. And so it's one of the toughest issues that immigrants face here. Where does that cycle stop?
Yeah, and that's one reason I had a child very late in life, and I almost didn't want to have a kid because it was a scary proposition. How do you raise a child when this is so programmed into you? And I think before I married my wife, who's a Korean American woman, I almost entirely dated women who were immigrants or daughters of immigrants, because I think without that understanding of how all that stuff is based, that's the biggest cultural divide for me, is how your parents treat you. I would date native-born American women, and it was just a whole different milieu, and I couldn't quite understand, how do you not hit? How are you not hit? That was such an integral part of growing up, because this idea of constantly being constantly fearing them, in a very Old Testament way. My father was my God.
There is a large immigrant literature and immigration on this about, how immigrants come here, and the children, the big issue is the children. Parents say, my children are calling 911, right? I mean, the big issue is whether we don't really know how many times the children really call 911, or how much the parents think they're going to call 911. But this fear that they're losing their authority over their children and want to keep them under control, and they're very afraid that their children are going to get caught up in, all the bad elements in American society, and they want to protect them. But I think what's also interesting, there have been some accounts about what happens with the children of immigrants who grow up here. I mean, they're often themselves are angry at their parents, and for the kind of, for hitting them or using physical punishment. And yet what's interesting is often they say when they grow older and they have their own children, they often say, well, I want to combine the best of both worlds, right? I don't want to be like my parents. I want to talk to my children. I don't want to just hit them. But on the other hand, I think maybe Americans are too loose. They're not strict enough. So I think there's often, maybe there's, trying to bring the worlds together. Phil, in your book, in Inheriting the City, you also talk about that.
Yeah, and in addition, of course, there's a great irony underlying all of this, which is that, well, in Caribbean New York, a lot of the people that I interviewed in the West Indian community in Brooklyn would always say, to their children, you're becoming American. And the worst thing they could say, my kids are becoming American, as if this was, the sign of the absolute loss of all morals or integrity of any sort. At the same time, everything they'd done since they came here had made that inevitable, right? They'd moved into more American neighborhoods, the mix, just basically they were they were telling their kids, don't you become like the people around you, but at the same time making it completely inevitable by everything that they'd done. And it's a paradox.
Yeah, it's a paradox. Yeah, and my parents always used this Russian saying, which is very hard to translate, but it means something like, Americans are wild with their own fat. Which I always pictured a giant fat person kind of dancing around, wildly gyrating, and stomach and breasts hitting each other, But the idea was that they're so spoiled. They grew up with so much. But at the same time, be like them in terms of being a successful lawyer or doctor, whatever they wanted me to be. But don't be like them. And my parents would talk about how uncultured their coworkers were, how they didn't know very basic things, because the Russian Soviet education system was wonderful. And all the Soviet Jews were always, the father was a mechanical engineer, the mother was a pianist. They all had these very great professions, and then all of a sudden they're meeting people around the playground, and they don't know who Schopenhauer was. So, so it was both this hate this country because they're stupid, but also be like them because they're rich.
I guess to step back from it a second, since you're both two of the greatest voices of this new generation of immigrants becoming American. Do you have any ideas about how that does or doesn't resemble previous generations of immigrant writers in New York? What's different today?
Well, I grew up reading the great Jewish and Italian writers about immigration, particularly Bernard Malamud, Isaac Bashevis Singer. You know, there were people, Philip Roth, and now I read, well, Gary, Jhumpa Lahiri, Juno Diaz, Akhil Sharma, and we see the same themes. I remember when an Italian friend of mine who'd grown up in Queens, and his parents were immigrants, and he came over to my parents' house in Ridgewood, New Jersey, and he heard my sister arguing with my mother, and you know, it's a heated argument. They were arguing in Gujarati, and he said, "Same plot, different language." And I often feel, you know, this, when I read those earlier generations of immigrant writers, I mean, Portnoy's complaint, that liver scene. A friend of mine, Ruchir, has this fantastic equivalent with the protagonist doing to this Gujarati sweet called Shrikhand, what was done to the liver in Portnoy's complaint. So, so yeah, there's a continuum, and it's really in, you know, the classes that I teach, I try to bring in those earlier generations of writers. I think that one of the differences is that maybe this generation goes back to their countries of origins much more. You know, we go back and forth, and so there's, it's somehow easier not to melt into any sort of pot. And we not only go back to our countries of origins, but we go to a third and a fourth country. You know, we might go to Brazil or Norway, and so it's maybe a more expansive vision of the world.
Yeah. No, I agree. One book that I teach that I still think is like one of the most important books to read in terms of understanding immigration to America is not Philip Roth, but Henry Roth's Call It Sleep. Oh my God, that book! And then when you read that book, and then you should also read, was it called Redemption? I believe is a biography to understand the layering of what was happening there, which was essentially that Henry Roth, also a great CUNY grad, was sleeping with his sister and his cousin. And that stuff is sort of present in the book. There's scenes that hint at that, but what you get is the sense of incredible sort of claustrophobia and incestuous, either really incestuous or metaphorically incestuous relationship that families, tight-knit families, had when they came to America. You know, and I think that still goes on, but I think there's less of it in the sense that now, as Suketu was saying, you know, back then in Call It Sleep, there's one portrait drawn from the old country, and the kid keeps saying, it's from the old country, so it must be special, because that's the only clue he has to understanding his parents, because he can't go back, he's living in this tiny world. And so right now, of course, the fact that kids can, you know, put on the latest music from the countries from which their parents emigrated, go back to that country, read books about that country, about their own experiences, the 1.5 generation, I think makes it a lot more, opens up the world a lot more than it did for somebody of Henry Roth's generation, for sure.
Yeah, I also think, in addition to the fact that obviously that culture is just so much more global and that you have access to that and travel is so much easier, there's also kind of the historical fact that immigration largely came to a halt in the mid-20s. So when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s in New York, all the old people had accents, but nobody my parents' age had an accent. So to the point where, you know, you assumed that having an accent was just something that happened when you got older. Which I regret to say it's sort of happening a little bit. I'm trying to repress it. But that was it. I mean, I knew nobody over the age of 60 who spoke unaccented English, and virtually everybody who was 35 didn't. So there was kind of a marching through history together, whereas I think at the present moment, there's such a mix of experiences that you sit in a classroom in Stuyvesant today, and there will be you know, the children of immigrants and people who came yesterday and people who went back and forth and people who were born here but actually spent most of their lives in other places. And I think that that's probably a more common kind of experience at this point.
And there's also a kind of global elite that I often see at Columbia where they may have come for grad school or undergrad and they grew up in wherever, Japan or wherever, but they went to international school from day one, that they actually speak better English than many of the native-born people. It's such a mishmash of different things and cultures.
Yeah, I guess it's, you know, it's interesting because in the social science literature, there's a great debate, or not debate, you know, interest in these kinds of, we call them transnational ties that immigrants and their, you know, and the big, maintain to their home country and to other countries. And the big, one big question is to what extent will the children of immigrants maintain these ties? And actually, and Phil is the, you know, in his book, they found that most did not actually maintain very extensive ties. So I guess the question is, I know maybe the writers are different, I mean maybe, or certain groups. And then of course if we look in the past, particularly if we're thinking about Jewish writers, right, in the past, Jews you know, certainly after the turn of the 20th century, very few of them went back at all. I mean, they really did come to stay. So there wasn't that much back and forth among that group that was running. The Italians, maybe they didn't write as many novels, right? They were too busy going back and forth because actually they went back and forth, birds of passage. They were going back and forth all the time. So I guess maybe a larger question is, you know, to what extent the experiences of writers, perhaps, and what they're writing about is mirroring the experience of the group as a whole. I don't know. I mean, it's a question.
You know, I deal with this in my new book, this transnationalism. I call them interlocals. And the sociologist Robert Smith, who I believe teaches here.
He's not here tonight. But he is here. He has an office. He teaches in our program and works on Mexicans. Yeah.
You have this amazing book, Mexican New York, which I learned a lot from. And he looks at one community in Sunset Park who regularly go back to a village he calls Ticuani in Puebla. And so once a year there is this Fiesta del Padre Jesus, and the people in the village, the girls of the village who are in Sunset Park, they cut off their hair, which is sent back to the village in Puebla to make a wig for the saint. And the people here who have papers go back there and they carry the statue of the Padre Jesus from Mexico City to this village, and then they recreate the same fiesta, it's called the Antorcha, over the Manhattan Bridge, and they install a replica of the saint in a church in Brooklyn. So, the interlocals are people who have allegiance not necessarily to a country, or even a state, or not even to a city, but to a specific locality. They're deeply vested in two or more localities. And I find that with a lot of people that I know. I live now in Greenwich Village, and then I go back to Bombay, and I'm in Malabar Hill in Bombay. I go back and forth between these two places, just as these Mexicans might go from Sunset Park to this village in Puebla. And, you know, what is exile when a round trip home is $400? And if you're lucky enough to have papers, I find that many of these people live in a continuum of two or more localities that they're deeply vested in. And this is, I think, a hopeful sign for the world.
Yeah, I spent a wild week or two with Suketu in Bombay as the ultimate, of course, guide to Bombay. And almost all the friends that he introduced me to were deeply transnational. I mean, they were all, Bombay was sort of like, you know, the spouse they couldn't quite divorce completely. They were thinking, everyone was always talking about leaving her or him, however you want to personify Bombay. But, you know, part of their hearts were in Berlin or New York or London or Addis Ababa for one woman. So, you know, I do agree with that more. And I think almost one of the things that distinguishes how people fit in is their accent, you know, and this is something that I dealt a lot with. So in my home, we only spoke Russian. My parents did this thing that was very nice, was only speaking Russian. Because as a 7-year-old, it's possible to lose most of your language. And if I had spoken English with them, they would have learned English better than they have, because the child always brings English into the home. But one thing I'm very thankful for them doing is to make sure that I can still speak and read and write in Russian. But my own accent was very difficult to overcome at that age. It took me until I was 14 to really lose most of it. And I would practice by listening to, what's his name, the jazz singer, They Come Into America. You know who I'm talking about, that guy. Neil Diamond, yeah. Yeah, Neil Diamond taught me English, so.
That's a quote, right?
Yeah, that's a quote. Yeah, thanks, Neil. But you know, but that's I think younger generations, at least when I encounter them, have a much easygoing relationship to that. They don't think, well, I'm this or that. It's I'm this and that, right?
Now, I want to just turn to one more topic before we open it up, and that's politics, right? We always have to get to politics today, right? So both of your books were written in the shadow of the 2016 presidential election, and Trump figures and the presidency figures in both of your books. And so I don't know if you could talk a bit about, now I don't want to, I don't know the best way to put it. I'm going to put it this way, but okay. Can you talk a bit about Trump's impact on your work? Trump is not here. He's not going to tweet about this, right? He'll say, oh, I had a great impact on your work.
He's a big a reader of literature. I mean,
But
did you see him writing about Toni Morrison the other day on Twitter? It was such a nuanced argument about Beloved.
Okay, but you know what I mean. Okay, but how did Trump get? How does Trump figure in your work, or how did it does?
Well, you know, he's a Queen's boy too.
Yes. Jamaica States.
And you know, so is Archie Bunker. No accident, I think, that he grew up in Jamaica Estates, which back then was this segregated white enclave, and now is overrun by Bangladeshis. So this new book that I'm coming out with really was a response to the 2016 election. For the first time in my 40-plus years in this country, I felt my place in the country challenged. As of the summer of 2018, 90%, around 90% of Republicans still liked Donald Trump, and they constitute some 1/3 of the country. So I realized, you know, my home is in the other 2/3. I took a break from my New York book to write this book about global migration, which basically turns the tables on the whole immigration debate, which is generally about, you know, how many people should we let in? Should we, will there be good little immigrants or not? And what I'm asking is, why are people moving in the first place? It's because the rich countries have stolen the future of the poor countries through colonialism, war, inequality, and climate change. And it's a deeply political book, again, in response to Trump's constant denigration of immigrants as rapists and thieves and malingerers. And I mean, look at what fear of migrants has done to the West. Fear of migrants is doing incalculably greater damage to these countries than the migrants themselves ever could. Look at Brexit, the biggest own goal in British history, occasioned primarily by fear of migrants. Trump now wants to shut down the Mexican border because he's afraid of. Do you know what that's going to do to avocado toast? So, you know, that year, the annus horribilis I teach at NYU, and my students were weeping all over Greenwich Village. But it was also the year where my brother-in-law, Jay Chaudhry, he ran for state senate in North Carolina. And he was an Indian American in a district where 70% of his constituents couldn't even pronounce his last name correctly. He was running against a man with a fine southern name of Ellis Hankins. He knocked on 10,000 doors, my brother-in-law, and explained to them that he wanted to fix the schools. And he won in a landslide. So that gave me hope for this country. And again, you know, I'm going to fight for this country. I'm going to fight for my place in this country, and I'm going to fight for the country to still lift its lamp by the golden door.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's very hard as a writer of literature. It's very hard to function in this kind of environment because I think what Trump does, and this is what good dictators do, is that he monopolizes thought space. You know, writers of novels, short stories, yes, there's an environment, there's a background, but it's about us, families, communities, how we interact with each other. And so much of that has been quashed by the omnipresence of Trump in everything, in conversations, in interactions. I have a 5-year-old kid, and what he now sees as a form of public bullying whenever the television is on. And it's, you know, this is the age of the electronic age that has enabled this kind of advanced thing. In the old days, you know, the dictator Franco would put his, you know, his poster on in the town square, and that's what you'd see of him. But now it's everywhere. It's every time you open up your phone. There's, you know, Trump, Trump, Trump. So when I started writing Lake Success, this was 2016. And the conceit of Lake Success is there's this schmucky hedge fund guy who flees his family in Manhattan, and he gets, for complicated reasons, he gets on a Greyhound bus and he goes from New York to San Diego. So I spent 4 months on a Greyhound bus. You're welcome, yeah. And when I got on that bus, it was June, and I thought, all right, you know, whatever. I thought this is not going to be a book about Trump because he's the sideshow, but I'm gonna put in, you know, in every couple of chapters, my characters look up, and on CNN, Trump is bloviating. So the way, you know, just to set the scene, because the year is 2016, the way if you write about the 80s, you'll have a Rubik's Cube or something on the table, right? But then, by the time 4 months later, by the time I got off the bus in San Diego, you know, I'd gone from thinking Hillary was going to win to, you know, pricing Toronto real estate. Because that was a fascinating trip, because throughout the entire trip, people would tell me, you're wrong. She's not going to win. Hillary's not going to win. You have no idea what's going on. And there was a chapter in the book which really happened, because I have no imagination. It's all journalism, really. I was in a state, we'll call it Louisiana, and this was July, and all these white supremacists got on the bus. It was mostly African Americans and myself, and they started talking very loudly about crucifying Muslims and Jews. I belonged to one of those categories. And like my character, I got off the bus in Shreveport and bought a New Testament coloring book, which they had in abundance, sold by a nice Gujarati gentleman who was probably saying, yeah, make sure they don't kick your ass. So I brought it back on, and they were looking at me now with less homicidal, you know, eyes. And one thing I remember very much is we passed through a traditionally historically African-American college, Grambling State University. And as we passed it, the white supremacists were all sitting in the front of the bus. Of course, were in the back of the bus, as tradition dictates. And one of them was looking at all the African-American students who were, you know, just hanging out, and he said, look at that. They have their own university, and one day we'll have ours. And I thought, what part of Dartmouth don't you understand? But to me, this was the first time, and they were quoting Breitbart and, you know, all this stuff, and speaking admiration about Trump, and this was the first time I realized that this existed not just in an imagination. This was the reality on the ground, and I thought, what if the people on the bus in 6 months would be the people in the government? And that's what happened.
On that optimistic note,
On that note,
we perhaps should open to some questions from the audience. So if you would like to go to the microphones on either side.
So this is primarily a question for Gary, but I'd be interested in knowing if there are parallels in other immigrant communities. I'm a Russian Jewish immigrant myself, and I found that a lot of the Russian Jewry specifically absolutely hates Putin. Despite that, a lot of them seem to absolutely love Trump. And so for me, this is a paradox, because there are a lot of parallels and there's friendship between the two. So, you know, why this paradox? And are there other immigrant communities that hate their own authoritarian rulers, but see something in Trump that's exceptional.
Are you a graduate student?
Recent grad.
Recent grad, okay. I mean, this is something I hope that is tackled in a scholarly fashion because it's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure somebody is. Well, I wouldn't say that all Russians like Putin. I mean, my parents are interesting in that they've always voted Republican, but they sat out the last election and they said, they hate Putin, and they said, we can't vote for Trump because we know he's in Putin's pocket. Which made me so proud of that finally they broke through the Fox and Friends. They unfriended Fox and Friends. But I think I would say, and this may be an exaggeration, is that growing up, that Russians looked up to anyone who they thought had strength, right? So Ronald Reagan, strength, complete strength. Jimmy Carter, fakakta Carter, they would say in Yiddish. The very opposite of strength, because he was a nice gentleman who, but Reagan was especially interesting for me because he radicalized, I think, a lot of Soviet Jews. They were predisposed to like him anyway because their right-wing politics and their fear that the Democrats were compromised by communism, et cetera, socialism. So they were like Cuban Americans as well. They were predisposed to vote for him. But I think I remember very clearly that the sort of breaking line for them was when he brought up the subject of welfare queens, right, as a kind of slur against the African community. This really clicked with them, because many Soviet immigrants came and they didn't have the same jobs that they had back home. They weren't engineers. Many of them were taxi drivers, etc. So they felt less than to a lot of native-born white people. But this was permission to hate somebody else, to look down upon somebody else, and they went for it. And the other part of the joke was that all of our grandmothers were collecting Section 8 in apartments in Queens while denouncing their brethren to the Social Security Administration. So but it didn't matter because we were okay. It was understood that welfare queens wasn't directed at us, that was directed at a specific demographic. And that, I think, is the connection maybe to Trump, who makes perfect sense for them, and also the anti-Muslim rhetoric and their support for Israel, which they think moving the embassy, all this stuff is a great help to Israel. So for all of these reasons, I think they stick with Trump. But I would say, I would love to know how many of them think Putin is I think it's not an entire dismissal. I think there are many, many who support Putin as well. Yeah.
Well, we Indians have our own version of Putin, Narendra Modi, who I call the Gujarati Elvis. And like Putin, he likes to sort of show off his raw masculinity, boasts of his 56-inch chest. And when he came here, he filled up Madison Square Garden with 35,000 screaming fans. Now, these are the same people in Jackson Heights, as I mentioned, who were my neighbors, who really, for the first time in their lives, met Pakistanis and found out that we were essentially the same people. Our kids played with each other, dated each other. But all these people, the Pakistanis and the Indians and the Bangladeshis, often sent back money to the most right-wing groups in their countries. And part of that was because these right-wing groups were good at preying on the guilt of those who had left. Look, you Indians, you've left India, and now Pakistan is attacking us daily, and the Muslims are overrunning the country, so you should spend this money. So much of the money for the BJP, which is Modi's party, comes from Indians in North America. It's a strange paradox, because Indians as a whole do not like Trump. In the presidential election, only 14% of Indian Americans, I'm proud to say, voted Republican.
That's interesting. Yeah, absolutely true. Going back to my father giving money to Rabbi Kahana, who was a convicted terrorist. But the idea of, I wasn't a good enough, I couldn't practice my Judaism. I missed out on 4 years of Judaism. I feel guilty about that. Let me give money to somebody who, kills Arabs, but that's part of the program. Yeah.
But of course, again, the typical New York story, and I can think of neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn where this happens, is that you often will have Palestinian and Jewish radicals doing business together, not really liking each other, able to deal with each other in a fairly civil way, while sending money for their cousins to go kill each other, which seems to be a very New York story, in part out of guilt. You're absolutely right.
Thank you. This is so fascinating. I'd like to move away from politics, if I may. I'm more interested in identity politics and what you were talking about originally, about this sense of going back and being part of the 1.5 generation. Because I know I consider myself second generation, and I was born in Nassau County, sort of western Nassau County, and there was always this question of what are you, right? So who are you, what are you? And I just wondered if, as writers, if you've thought about this much for yourself. I know that you've probably written about it, but just like, how do you, when someone says to you, what are you? Do you say Indian American? Do you know, how do you quantify that?
Yeah, I mean, I just say New Yorker. Yeah, well, you know, it's funny, right? Because I lived in Italy for a while, and you know, there was a lot of anti-American stuff, and people say, un scrittore russo. You know, I'm like, well, I'm not that russo, you know. But New Yorker, people are like, okay, that's considered acceptable, right? But I don't know. I mean, I don't know why. I remember, so I teach Philip Roth, and I remember Roth and Bellow and that whole generation, when they were being called Jewish American writers, they get really pissed off. They'd say, screw that, I'm an American writer. Because that really, they were trying to really avoid that label, while at the same time writing almost entirely about the Jewish American experience. And nowadays, I don't know, maybe it's the way that we're packaged when our publishers get wind of what we're writing, like, oh yeah, more immigrant stuff, because Americans love immigrant stuff. They may not like immigrants, but they love immigrant fiction. We are a country that translates almost nothing from abroad. You know, so you look at a country like Germany or Spain or Italy or France, you get something between 30 to 60% of the works sold are works in translation. Not here. We don't want that stuff. Oh, those smelly foreigners, who knows what they're up to. But the immigrant becomes a kind of bridge, a translation. That's why we love, because, oh my God, they came here, they actually moved here, so they're okay with us, right? They're abandoning all the smelly stuff, and let's hear how they're gonna do it, you know? And so we're in this weird position where some of the best sellers in American fiction comes from immigrant writers, but not from works translated from abroad where people actually have full knowledge of what it's like to live in those places. That to me is an interesting paradox.
I know you said you wanted to move away from politics, but unfortunately it is a very political question, particularly now when, you know, after a long time, again, I feel my identity questioned. You know, it used to be okay to say, I was born in India and I now live in America. And I'm an American, my kids were American. So that fact of my being American is now freshly being called into question. So as a writer, you know, early on when I started out in fiction, I'd write a lot about this issue. Where do I belong? Am I hyphenated? Am I an Indian American writer? And then I started also kind of bridling at this, being ghettoized as an Indian American writer. And, you know, I remember once going to a large bookstore here, and there were different shelves for sort of immigrant writing, and there were a lot of Indian American writers who had started winning awards and whatnot. And then I asked if they had a shelf of white writing. And they kind of looked at me and said, yeah, right. That's just in the fiction section. That's all of and, you know, I mean, I understand the need for academics to look at groups of writers and look for common themes, but you know, when we want a plumber, we don't ask for a Venezuelan American plumber. When we want an accountant, we don't care if the accountant doesn't need to be hyphenated. So why do we need writers to know about their origins in order to understand their work?
Hi. So I opened a public high school in Seward Park High School in 2004. And so my school served largely kids of color and many first-generation kids from the Caribbean and Central America. On the walls were a lot of pictures of Seward Park's famous graduates from previous generations, including Walter Matthau and lots of people who looked like Walter Matthau. And the basic story that we would hear from older folks in the neighborhood, and I think really around public education in general, was like all about the good old days, right? And like the good immigrants versus the current bad immigrants, to put it racistly and bluntly. So I'm just curious for your perspective. I've often felt like some huge part of the story is probably missing from those pictures on the walls of what public school was really like and whether it actually was better when when you guys went to school, but if you could speak to that.
I think this is all horse shit, right? And you guys can, not what you're saying, but the sentiment behind that, right? And you guys who have done the research will surely know this, but immigrants assimilate the way they always have, right? There's absolutely no difference between how people assimilated 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and every generation that comes here gets taught, oh my God, you're horrible. You're the Red Gerbil, go away, right? And then we all assimilate, and 2 generations later, nobody can tell the difference, right? So this is just red meat for certain political movements that have existed throughout the history, and they're called what? Republicans, I guess.
Well, Phil, you were part of this National Academy of Science report on immigrant assimilation. I think you found that you wrote it, yeah. So, so it's, and I think you found that by the second generation, immigrants assimilate at the same rates as earlier. But this idea of good and not so good immigrants, there was a book which came out a few years ago, since we were talking about parents hitting their children, by Amy Chua, the tiger mom or jackal mom or wolf mom. It was a book called The Triple Package, and Time magazine sent it to me to review, and it had exactly this kind of theory, that there were 8 good groups of immigrants, which included Jews, Chinese, and then other not so good groups, by omission there were, Mexicans, and there was all this praise of Indians and how well Indian Americans do in this country. And I remember sending, calling up both Phil and Nancy and asking them about this, and the authors, Amy Chua and her husband, Jed Rubenfeld, Yale law professors, they were careful to say their book wasn't racist because they also included Liberians as part of sort of good immigrants. And they talked about how, it's not that these other cultures are inferior, it's just that they don't have this triple package of impulse control and a superiority complex. And if only, these other not so good groups could be like the good group. So Phil's conclusion was, you too can be Chinese. And there was all this praise of, the Indian immigrants were overrepresented in schools like Stuyvesant. But, as I said in my article, if Indians are so great, what explains India? And if India had a land border with the United States, like Mexico does, we'd be singing a different tune about Indian Americans, because the poorest would go over. So, American history is full of these racist cranks who have, before it was Northern Europeans are superior to Southern Europeans. I mean, The Great Gatsby has a wonderful section about this writer named Goddard, who privileged the Nordic people. Who else has liked Nordics in our time, as opposed to people from the shithole countries? Yeah, it never dies, this story.
I'd love to see the great Stephen Miller novel, right? Like, right? Should I write it? Yeah. Okay. Nice Jewish guy from Santa Monica? No.
Hi. I've been thinking a lot about the stigma and also the appraisal of the Generation 1.5 term. So like on the one hand, I'm aware that there is a stigma because it kind of suggests that someone is not a full person or they may not totally belong to an identity. But at the same time, I'm aware that also people are embracing this kind of notion of hyphenated identities. So in my own work, I'm working on Chinese Americans and Chinese students across generations 1, 1.5, and 2. And I'm finding that there's an in-betweenness in how they self-identify regardless of their generationality. So I guess my question is, one, like, where do you stand on this stigma of 1.5? And 2, do you see the definition of 1.5 evolving as diaspora happens more rapidly and globalization happens more rapidly and we get information cross-culturally more rapidly?
It's such a good question, a series of questions. I don't see it at all diminishing. I mean, it's not less than one person, it's 1.5 persons, right? That's what I remember from Stuyvesant, fractions. So I've always seen that as a bit of a compliment, because also, I mean, in my mind, there's 1.5, to me, a fully 1.5 person is somebody who speaks their language, maybe not perfectly, their parents' language, who knows the traditions very well, who has gone back. It's somebody who's really more than just, 50% American, 50% wherever you're from. You're more than that. And to me, that takes a certain kind of discipline to be able to live in those two worlds. And I really see that as a specialty. But the work that you have to do when you're an immigrant of the 1.5 variety is really hard because it's the hardest work imaginable. And I think that's why I became a writer. I became a writer to understand my parents. I just thought, okay, they hit me, they're nice, etc. What else is there? The food is terrible, but, And in writing, the best thing I did in that terms was writing a memoir, where I went back to Russia with them. They haven't been back in 20 years. I took them back. And I realized that my father, when he was 5 years old, his own father was killed in the war. He hid under a train as the Luftwaffe was strafing the train. They ate rats. They didn't have enough to eat. I mean, so my father never told me this, because often when they take 1.5 kids over, it's, hey, how are your grades, etc. But never telling you what motivates their own anxieties and fears about the fact that you're not doing well. So I took about 400 hours of interviews with both of them, and I came away, I grew up almost in the course of those interviews, from a child who fears the parents to maybe to an American in some ways, to somebody who's not an immigrant, but somebody who belongs here in every way possible, but also understands where I came from. And I think that when I read good literature, when I read good nonfiction like Suketu's, these are the questions that are being asked. To be asked, and it's an unfortunate question in some ways because yes, some people may find themselves luckier when they only have one identity, but for those of us who are curious, who are unstoppable in our hunger and curiosity to know more, being a 1.5 is the best thing that you can ever hope for.
I also think it's a precursor to the future of human life on the planet. Today, if all the migrants, the people who were born in one country and have moved to another, if all the migrants together would form a country, it would be the 4th largest country in the world, larger than Indonesia. And I think we should all strive towards 1.5-ness because it brings us out of narrow provincial nationalism, which is the biggest threat today to the planet.
I would also just add that while the 1.5 position is difficult, and it creates all sorts of hard work for people involved in it, the amount of American culture that has been generated by people who are in that position is really staggering and hugely disproportionate to their share of the population. And when you think about art or music or any of the creativity in this country, a huge amount has come from people who are exactly in that position. And I think that that's, well, and I would also add that when you have a place like New York today, or New York in the 1940s, in which most of the young people are in that position, you get a very creative mix of things going on for everybody, not just for those people, but for everybody else as well when that becomes the norm. Anyway, we have time for, I think, one more.
Well, thank you. Believe it or not, I'm a 1.5 person too. And it's really just an observation about migration patterns, I guess. But I remember when I got here as a young boy in 1946, Queens was for fancy people. That is, the people, most of us could not afford to go to Queens. Wound up either in someplace in Brooklyn, we did in Greenpoint, Lower East Side, and I remember we were very impressed by friends who could afford to go to Queens because I remember one family actually had a furnished basement. So things change over the decades. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On that moment, maybe we can all join me in thanking Suketu and Gary.